Welcome, everybody. We are thrilled to have Undersecretary of State Richard Stengel with us today to talk about breaking ISIL's brand. I am going to before we get to the introduction, I just want to tell you about a couple of things we have coming up next week at the Institute of Politics. Monday night, we will be doing a panel on the Gen Forward survey, which Kathy Cohen of the Political Science Department has been doing since June, every month, talking to youth about their attitudes towards the election, towards politics in general, how they're engaged, how they're not engaged. So we want as big an audience of you people there as possible to engage with her and tell her where she's got it right, where she's got it wrong. David Axelrod will be on the panel, as well as Jesse Moore from Rock the Vote, and it'll be moderated by Emma Green from The Atlantic. It'll be really interesting, I think. And then on Thursday, we have three rising stars, three young mayors from Tallahassee, South Bend, Indiana, and LaPorte, Indiana, who are going to be talking with Mayor Anise Parker of Houston, former Mayor Anise Parker, about their solutions to some problems that have plagued cities for years and how youthful innovation is changing their cities for the better. So without further ado, I want to introduce Adriana Hull, who will introduce tonight's program. Adriana is a poli-sci and environmental studies major from San Diego, and she's co-chair of our tech team, which is one of our most active student civic engagement projects. And Adriana, take it away.
Hi, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, the Honorable Richard Stengel. Prior to being nominated as Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs in the U.S. State Department, Undersecretary Stengel spent much of his career at Time magazine, where he climbed the ranks, beginning as a contributor in 1981. He ultimately became the 16th managing editor in 2006. Undersecretary Stengel also served as a speechwriter for Bill Bradley's campaign and as the CEO and president of the National Constitution Center. Notably, Mr. Stengel collaborated with Nelson Mandela on his 1995 autobiography, The Long Walk to Freedom. He was also one of the producers of the Oscar-nominated Mandela and was awarded an Emmy as an executive producer on Beyond 9/11: Portraits of Resilience. Mr. Stengel was named Citizen of the Year in 2010 for his work in helping to establish Service Nation, a coalition of service groups focused on national service through community service and his efforts to promote such service opportunities. In a world in which we are globally connected through the media that did not even exist a decade ago, the task of understanding the recruitment strategies of groups such as ISIL and the leadership strategies needed to defeat them has never been more important. Leading the conversation with Undersecretary Stengel is political science professor Paul Staniland. Please join me in welcoming Undersecretary Stengel.
Thank you.
Great, thanks for that introduction. So I just wanted to begin by asking you kind of what your job involves. So in your job description, it indicates you provide strategic leadership on all Department of State public diplomacy and public affairs engagement, and oversee the bureaus of educational and cultural affairs, international information programs and public affairs, and the Global Engagement Center. So that's a lot of things. Tell us kind of what you do.
Very confusing, isn't it?
It is, yeah, hence the question.
So the real question is, what is public diplomacy? Anybody know? I didn't really know either when I got the job. The shortest way to explain public diplomacy is soft power. You know that expression, soft power and hard power? Soft power is America's influence in terms of the culture that we create, in terms of our educational institutions. Public diplomacy is not diplomacy between states. It's really between people or government and people. So we call it people-to-people diplomacy. And I think it's as old as the Republic, because in the Declaration of Independence, when they wrote, "with a decent respect for the opinions of mankind," they were talking about public diplomacy. So another way to put it is, I'm the chief marketing officer for the brand USA around the world. And all of those pieces that are under public diplomacy, those educational exchanges, so that's ECA. So for example, people don't realize this, Fulbright scholarships, that's a State Department program. So educational exchanges, public affairs is the easy thing to understand, and that's the spokespeople who stand behind a podium every day at every embassy around the world and at the State Department and say, here's our policy today, and here's why we did what we did, and they try not to make mistakes. That's the biggest thing about public affairs.
Could you tell me a little bit about how you got into this position? Because you have a background as a journalist, and so I'm curious, kind of, how did you end up where you are today?
So when my first year at Time, when I was editor of Time, we had a week where we didn't have a cover story, and I had been going on and on about, let's do a cover story about national service. And we didn't have a cover, and of course, journalism world, you can't, it's much more horizontal. And someone said, well, we don't have a cover, why don't you write it, Mr. Editor? So I wrote a cover story called The Case for National Service, and it was actually based on some guys who started public service programs in Boston, and one of the keys was that every young person in America between high school and college should do a year of national service. And so, it was a very popular cover, and we ended up doing an issue every year about national service. It actually got a lot of advertising, so it's Ben Franklin said it was doing well by doing good, which is sort of what national service is. So by the time I was, been editor for like 7 or 8 years, and I talked to people in the Obama administration, and they offered me this job, I felt like I should walk the walk and not just talk the talk. And I always knew I wanted to give it a try, and so that was it.
So I think the focus today really is on counter-ISIL operations. So I wanted to ask you to give kind of a sense of how you think about public diplomacy as applied to the issue of ISIL and kind of the broader Muslim world. And then I'm going to ask some more specific questions about how you guys operate in that space.
It's a bit of a almost an accident that I'm involved in counter-ISIL messaging, because under Secretary Clinton, she started something called the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, which was counter Al-Qaeda messaging, because Al-Qaeda was so sophisticated in social media because guys sat on a hillside in Pakistan and talked directly to camera for 45 minutes, and they loaded it up to YouTube, and everyone thought that was, terrifying. And it happened to be put under public diplomacy because there wasn't a natural home within the State Department for it. So when I came in, that organization still existed, and we really started seeing the rise of ISIL, as we call it in government. And I got really fascinated and interested in that. And so I looked after CSCC, and then CSCC has now become something called the Global Engagement Center, which was signed in by an executive order from President Obama only 6 months ago. And that mission is to counter ISIL messaging, and we'll talk more about that.
So how is the Global Engagement Center different than what came before that was more focused on Al-Qaeda?
The difference is actually elemental, and the thing that we realized with CSCC in government, when people in government see something they don't like, they go, how do we counter it? So there's lots of titles in government of counter this and counter that, and the natural thing would happen when they became so powerful on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, was let's counter it. Let's do tit for tat. They have this number of tweets a day, well, we need to do more. And what we realized is that countering in that way doesn't really make sense. I mean, the government is not the best messenger for the message that we want to get out there. If we want to tell people, hey, these guys are not, they don't represent Islam, they're violent, they're criminals. Their narrative is the West is against Islam. So a tweet from the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy telling a young guy not to go fight in Iraq and Syria is going to actually have the opposite effect. So in the transition to the Global Engagement Center, what we realized is what we need to do is empower other voices, credible voices, mainstream Muslim voices, to counteract ISIL messaging. And that was much more powerful than government messaging.
So what does that look like day to day? Is this you guys retweeting other people or providing funding? Like, what kind of tell us about the range of activities that you engage in?
Well, one of the interesting things was, and I did obviously come from a media background, so I hadn't quite seen what was out there. And when ISIL started becoming popular and effective on social media, there was no counter even among credible voices. I mean, there's a certain reticence in the Muslim world and the Middle East, and they were didn't have anybody answering them. What we've seen over the past 2 years is this organic rise of counter-ISIL content from groups that just are so opposed and find them so odious. So for example, to use one example, 2 years ago when we started talking to other groups, there's Dar al-Ufta in Egypt, which is the sort of think tank of the Grand Mufti of Egypt, who was one of the most powerful Muslim leaders in the world. I remember I went to see them, and one of the imams handed me a sheaf bigger than that of, these are all the fatwas that we issued today, all on paper. And I said, well, you think you could turn them into tweets? Well, it took a long time, but we had a meeting recently, and they now have a fatwa app. And what they realized is all these groups that have credible voices, that are counter-ISIL, have realized they need to compete. And so one of the things that GEC does is it helps give people greater capacity. I mean, we teach them how to use social media, how to go from paper fatwas to digital fatwas. And some of it is, as you say, is retweeting. We still do tweet in 3 or 4 or 5 different languages, French and Urdu, Arabic, of course. So that's the stuff they do. I'll actually get to something really interesting later on that they do, but we need a little more preparation for that.
Okay.
So by the way, anybody know what the predominant language is that ISIL uses in social media? English? French. Kathy, you can't. Yeah. About 80 to 85% of all the content they create is in Arabic. They're focused on Arabic-speaking Muslims in the Middle East and around the world. Anybody know the second language that they? English. Russian. 12 or 13%, because they're looking for an audience there. They're looking for fighters, like the Chechen who was killed last year. Third is English. So this sense that we have that they're focused on us, misnomer. They're not focused on us. They want to scare us, but we are not their audience. They were like from my old world, they were a niche brand that became a gigantic global brand, in part because of the content they were doing, which were beheading videos, which young men like to watch. So they didn't realize that they would have this gigantic footprint. They only wanted to recruit a small number of people, 25 or 30,000 young men to fight in Iraq and Syria. I mean, 25 or 30,000, I mean, that's like, some tiny little intellectual magazine. The New York Review of Books, that's what the circulation is. But suddenly the New York Review of Books became like Facebook because of the content they were creating.
So maybe this is a good time to talk about what ISIL and other extremist organizations use social media for. How do they do it? What kind of range of platforms or apps or other programs are they using? And then how does the GEC kind of keep an eye on all of this and kind of track what must be a huge amount of traffic?
Well, one of it was a recruitment mechanism, which I talked about. Mm-hmm. But one of their innovations was that I'll put it this way. So in the military, there are things called lines of effort. So in this counter-ISIL campaign of 66 nations, there's the economic line of effort, there's the military line of effort, there's the communications line of effort, there's the use of historical artifacts line of effort. But what they did, what was innovative, is they combined their military line of effort and their communications line of effort. Everything they did on the battlefield, they filmed, they turned into social media. And this was, it's not completely new under the sun, but Sun Tzu 2,000 years ago talked about how, you conquer more people by scaring them on the battlefield than by actually conquering them on the battlefield. So they did this in a much more sophisticated way than anybody had ever done. So they were effective on the military battlefield in part because they were engaging in digital warfare at the same time. So that made them seem like they were 10 feet tall. And then the third thing that they do is, they have they have a news agency, called Amaq in Raqqa. They have a distributed network of kind of ISIL fanboys, as we call them, who are hyper tweeters. And it's a very deregulated network where, each of them are like owned and operated TV stations that are affiliated with the network, but don't just do what the network tells them to do.
So all of these messages, I know Twitter is deeply involved here. I imagine Facebook. Are there other kind of social media platforms that we might not immediately think of where these messages are promulgated?
So one of the things that we've seen, and we talked a little bit about this before, there's been a gigantic decrease in the amount of content that they're doing. I mean, it's been publicized, as much as 70 or 80% diminishment in the content they're creating. And there are various reasons for it, but one of the reasons is not only the military victories, which, I mean, they basically will cease to exist on the military battlefield, within under a year. They've lost 50% of their territory in Iraq, 20% in Syria. But they're also being harassed by the social media companies themselves. Twitter has said that they've taken down more than 250,000 handles. Facebook has a 24/7 group that's taking this content down. I watch videos on YouTube. They literally get taken down in seconds sometimes, in just a small number of minutes. All of these platforms are determined to get them out of their ecosystem. They're polluting their ecosystem, as one of the Silicon Valley guys said to me. But one of the unintended consequences of what the tech companies are doing is that a lot of the messaging that ISIL does has migrated to end-to-end encrypted platforms, like Telegram, for example. Telegram is, after Twitter now, is their program of choice. Does anybody here on Telegram or use Telegram? Anybody use WhatsApp? Yeah, so WhatsApp is gigantically popular in the Middle East and all around the world, much more popular than it is here. It's also an end-to-end encrypted platform. And part of the reason they do that is that it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to hack it. But again, one of the benefits of it, from my perspective, because I'm in the communications and media business, is that they're reaching a much, much smaller audience. Telegram only goes to a specific audience. You have to know the names of the followers. People have to know your name to follow you. So they don't have this macro mouthpiece like they had before.
How do you keep an eye on all of these different media outlets and forms of communication? I mean, do you have a dedicated staff that's doing this in consultation with Twitter or Facebook, or how does this all work?
So the GEC, I mean, they have a very sophisticated monitoring system. Obviously, there are other parts of the government, the Defense Department, the intelligence community monitors this. I have a weekly classified briefing where I kind of look at what their greatest hits are that week, whether it's on video or social media. They actually have a print magazine called Dabiq, which has a whopping readership of about 900 people, many of whom are in the State Department. So we monitor it pretty closely. I mean, one of the things government does is they monitor things very well.
So what does success look like for you? I mean, what kind of metrics do you guys keep an eye on? How satisfied are you with them? And are there areas where you haven't seen success where you would have liked to?
Well, we're happy about the curtailment of the amount of content that they're creating, and that, as I say, I think is a mixture of the military success, the success of social media companies, and the rise of other credible voices that are kind of competing with them in that space. But again, the unintended consequence of it is this other phenomenon that people are worried about in the American domestic space is lone actors. So one of the things that we saw recently was Mohammed El-Adnani, who was their sort of communications czar, who was killed actually just after Ramadan, created a video before Ramadan where he said, don't come to the caliphate anymore. Coming to the caliphate used to be their chief argument, their chief mission. And by the way, it was an altruistic argument because the caliphate, as the Prophet said, it was the duty of all Muslims to create and come to the caliphate. So that's another thing that most people don't realize, is that most of their content was positive. It wasn't these beheading videos. It was the caliphate is wonderful. But as the actual physical caliphate has been eroded and diminished, El-Adnani, in this admonition to people, was saying, don't come to the caliphate anymore. Basically, it doesn't exist. Commit acts of violence wherever you are against the enemy, against the kafirs, against the non-believers. And that's part of the reason we think part of the reason that we've seen a rise of these lone actor assaults, whether it's in Orlando or San Bernardino. Because once upon a time, some of those folks might have said, hey, yeah, I'm going to go to Iraq and Syria and fight in the caliphate. But now, because that really is ceasing to exist as an option. In fact, the Defense Department estimates that the monthly flow of foreign fighters is down by 90%. The unintended consequences is now commit acts of violence wherever you are. So whether they're more organized attacks, like in Paris or Belgium, whether they're attacks in Orlando that seem more individually kind of managed, that is a consequence of our success.
Mm-hmm. Well, so how do you think about dealing with that kind of challenge? Do you use the same tools, the same messages as when aiming at ISIS proper in the Middle East, or do you tailor messages differently?
I think it's a little bit of a different problem, actually, it's related to the work you've done on insurgencies. Someone very smart said to me, when you're down to that granular level, it's much more of like an epidemiological model of a transfer of disease through intimate contact with a handful of people over and over. So you need to treat it the way you treat, diseases that are communicated like that, rather than through a more macro effort of messaging. Because all of these things that we've seen with so-called lone wolves, which I think is a misnomer, or lone actors as we call them, is that it's individual communications rather than mass messaging on Twitter. And so that it becomes much more of a law enforcement issue. It becomes a mental health issue. There are lots of studies now that show that tiny, small recruitment is much more like the psychological recruitment of gang members, where young men in particular need to feel some sense of belonging or meaning in their lives. And so it's a more difficult problem in some ways, but it is also a smaller problem. And my colleagues at the NSC and the White House, it keeps them up at night. This is the thing that people worry about, and it is a threat.
So as you think about I think a theme that emerged is empowering other voices that are not just the US government's Twitter account. And how do you kind of balance that? Because on the one hand, you want credible third-party voices that are not just you.
Right.
On the other hand, you want people who are kind of in line with US government policy, who are not necessarily saying other provocative or controversial things on other issues. So how do you kind of navigate that?
Well, it's a good question, and it's difficult terrain to navigate in the sense that I have a much more permissive view of, if someone is going to be a credible voice against ISIL, they can't exactly be pro-USA in every way. I think we have to be very tolerant of people who are anti-US in many respects and anti-ISIL. I would rather have them do that, because that also gives them credibility with the audience that they're trying to reach. So I think we have to be more open to that. There's some people who disagree with that, and we work with all kinds of people who who do have credibility. So even, for example, the imams, in the Middle East, sometimes there are imams who are affiliated with local governments, and the local governments are not exactly bastions of democracy and freedom of speech. So we work with those folks, and we work with imams who are not part of the government, who may actually be anti-government in some respects. So to me, it's the problem is ISIL, and if people are counter ISIL, that makes me for the most part want to work with them.
How much do you work with foreign governments as opposed to kind of non-governmental actors, political parties, clerics, et cetera?
So we do a lot of work with foreign governments, and foreign governments actually often have more credibility than we do. So for example, we helped create with the United Arab Emirates something called the Sawab Center in Abu Dhabi. The Sawab is in Arabic for the right path, and it's a social media hub that creates anti-ISIL content, that aggregates anti-ISIL content, that helps optimize credible voices in the region, and it's really a fantastic thing. We're doing another one with the Malaysians in Kuala Lumpur that has already started. We're working with the Organization of Islamic States to do one as well. So I think these are useful. And governments do have a role to play, and we see this as a kind of network of networks of people who want to make sure that violent extremist content and messaging and groups cease to exist.
So how much of your effort is directed specifically at ISIL as opposed to groups like the Afghan Taliban or Al-Qaeda? Is this kind of really focused on ISIL right now, and these are secondary issues, or is this kind of a holistic approach? How do you think about this general issue of kind of countering violent extremism?
I worked very closely with John Allen, General Allen, who was the original leader of the coalition, and he would always say to me, he said, the military battle is much easier than the information battle that you're on, and we only will truly win when we win on the information battlefield. And I think people who work on the information battlefield are conscious that all of these organizations have successors. And oftentimes the successors are even more nasty than their predecessors. And so as ISIL is losing on the military battlefield, they're morphing on the digital battlefield. And they have created alliances with Al-Shabaab and other groups. Al-Qaeda itself has still not gone away. And so we're conscious of who are the successor groups and how are they mobilizing. And one of the kind of, it's actually intuitive, not counterintuitive. I was about to say that one of the differences between ISIL and Al-Qaeda is Al-Qaeda never wanted to be a state. Al-Qaeda was a state of mind. ISIL wanted to create an actual state called the Caliphate. We're actually better at fighting state actors than non-state actors. And now that their state, they have a failed state before they even became a state, what do they morph into? That's something, again, that keeps me up at night and lots of people up at night.
So what trends do you see emerging, kind of looking into the next couple of years? I know it's speculative, but give us a sense.
Well, we talked a little bit about it. So we've seen the migration to encrypted platforms, the creation of their own encrypted platforms, the moving away from the caliphate as a state to these attacks in various homelands that are done by lone actors. I think we're looking at other types of recruitment where they are, I call it the weaponization of vulnerability, where they are looking for people, young men in particular, and young women too, who have some grievance, and to say, hey, the black flag can become the umbrella for your grievance, and the violence that you're willing to do, you can have it under our brand. And this kind of weaponization of vulnerability is something that's quite scary, and is a little different from that kind of much more kind of apocalyptic religious argument that they were making in the beginning.
So it's almost kind of a return to a franchising model in some sense.
Well, it's they're adaptive, and I think part of what makes them so dastardly and noxious is that they support violence of any kind against the West and people they consider infidels, no matter what the motivation is. So that's a flag of convenience that they're flying for those folks.
So to kind of return to the broader issue of public diplomacy, how do you coordinate kind of maybe social media focused campaigns with all these other things that public diplomacy involves, right? Which could be official government messages, things like Voice of America, educational exchanges. Mm-hmm. Is there a lot of coordination, or how do you think about how these pieces fit together?
There could always be more coordination, but one of the things I've tried to do is to do that kind of coordination. So for example, there are public diplomacy officers at every post around the world. They're the kind of legs of these campaigns, and they work with community groups. They do community programs that are CVE programs, which is counter-violent extremism. We're creating a cadre of public diplomacy CVE officers who specialize in this and will be at places around the world where there are threats. And even, for example, the educational programs that we do, the international visitors programs and exchanges. We do exchanges where young imams from around the world, young women, from the Middle East are coming here to learn, how we do things, to learn social media. So that's another way of kind of equipping this kind of information army that we have out there, which is really public diplomacy.
And so how much of this overall strategy has been informed by your background as a journalist? And maybe what do you bring to the table that wasn't there previously from people who kind of had more of a background in government or foreign service?
Well, for better or for worse, I tend to see everything as a media problem. Okay. And of course, not everything is a media problem, but insofar as as we've seen all over the world, that the military battlefield is now coupled with the information battlefield, that is I think has been helpful, and perhaps I've erred too much on kind of mobilizing people on social media. But what's been interesting about this and ISIL is that they see this as a media issue as well, and that's partially responsible for their success. And I think in that regard, on the information battlefield, approaching it as a media problem gives you a better chance of success, I think.
And you mentioned this merging of the military and informational battlefields, which kind of leads to the question, what do you do with Department of Defense or the military, you led with soft power, but how does this relate to American hard power, and how does that work?
Well, again, I mean, the folks at the Defense Department have been onto this for a very long time. I mean, what people call the gray zone or hybrid warfare, that's a mixture of hard power and soft power, of hard military and using information tactics. I mean, there are how many scholarly books written about how the Germans used that during World War II, and the Russians used it extensively during the Cold War. I mean, they seem to create the term for hybrid warfare. So the military folks are very, very sophisticated about this, and they are operating on that front as well, the intelligence community as well. So we're a kind of wingmen to them, and because what we do, we operate for the most part in the open, and it's more macro, whereas what they do is more micro.
So would you say there are any differences or substantial disagreements, I guess I should say, within the government on how to deal with this issue? You mentioned you're more open to local sources who are maybe not particularly pro-American. Is there variation within the US government and how people think about that issue?
I think there's a unanimity in that it's a problem, and a problem that we need to defeat. I think we've evolved in terms of how we approach it. I mentioned that, going from directly countering it ourselves to optimizing third parties. I think we're, particularly, the GEC is an interagency group. So there are detailees. God, I'm using government speak. I have to get out of that. Detailees from DOD and the intelligence community. So I think we're working in a much more coordinated way today than we were a couple of years ago.
And what kinds of people, what backgrounds, for students who might be interested in going into this, what are the backgrounds of the people who do this kind of work?
Well, we have a lot of people who are Arabic speakers, which is necessary. There are young people who are from the region or have backgrounds in the Middle East. There are people who have media or content creation backgrounds. It's a whole bunch of people. I actually think, as we go forward, that it should look and feel like a media company. And I think for people who are interested in that kind of nexus between diplomacy and information battlefield and cyber warfare, it's a very fascinating place to be. And as we move further into the 21st century, that is where so many of these global crises will exist.
So it sounds like actually kind of like a very diverse set of backgrounds, right? Pretty multidisciplinary, people from all kinds of different agencies. Who then kind of...
But now, of course, there are also, data analytics people
Sure.
who specialize in that, and I had used that in my old life, but the sophistication with which we use it in government is pretty high as well.
Can you talk just a little bit about that? How does the US government use data analytics? What kind of things are you looking at? There's some obvious things like number of tweets or whatever, but what else do you keep an eye on?
So data analytics are incredibly important, and in my old life, I always tell people in government that I used to have a data analytics tool on my computer in my office, and I could tell how many people were on time.com, which stories they were reading, how many pages they read, which ad they clicked on, and see that all in real time. And we need to have those capabilities in government. But remember, there's a sensitivity about this in government, and there's something called the Privacy Act, which does not allow the federal government to monitor online the activities of American citizens or collect PII, personally identifiable information. And there is this continuum in government and even outside of government between security and privacy. We saw it in the San Bernardino case with Apple and the Justice Department. And the tech companies are zealously trying to protect your privacy, and the government and law enforcement say, hey, we need to have a back door or a window into these activities to protect people. And this is a debate we're having as a country right now, and it's a really legitimate debate. It's a debate that we've had for 200 years. And so it's not resolved yet. And there are lots of complications, and the technology is a gigantic part of it. So as the technological ability to encrypt things gets even more sophisticated, in a way, it makes the argument moot if you can't get into a phone or you can't unlock something. Then privacy trumps those security issues. So this is going on right now. It's a really fascinating field of study, and it's just kind of at the beginning.
Great. So I think we just about need to switch to Q&A, but I thought if I could just indulge my historical side. Could you just briefly reflect on how public diplomacy has changed over the last few decades? What's changed and then what stayed the same, kind of going back to the 50s when this all really began?
So and we talked a little bit about this before, there's something that's called international broadcasting, and these were entities that were created really during and after World War II. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Office of Cuba Broadcasting. And this was during the Cold War, which was an information battlefield as well between two different ideologies. And the other difference in that day and age was information was scarce. So part of what we were doing, we were creating entities that could get actual data, facts, newspapers, television stories across the Iron Curtain, because that was a zone where they didn't have that free flow of information. And our belief was that when people have free flows of information, when they can see the truth and reality, we will triumph in that ideological battle. What's different now is information is not scarce anymore. And that old idea of, like, if only we told people the truth, we would triumph is a bit of an anachronism. And what we see instead is this rise of disinformation and untruths and people's inability around the world to really separate fact from fiction. And that, to me, is the new battlefield of the 21st century. And I think as those agencies, which still exist and are important, they need to change into the competitors in that battlefield. And that's a more difficult one in some ways.
That was really interesting. Thank you for indulging me on that. All right, so I think it's now time for Q&A. And so yes, just put your hands up, and people have microphones. Here and then here.
Hi. What's your view on the effectiveness of drone strikes? Because it may decapitate 10 leaders, but then if that's used for recruitment and they can then recruit many more fighters, what's your view on the effectiveness of that strategy?
So it's a very good question, and it's a public diplomacy issue, the ramifications of drone strikes. And if you look at countries where there have been many drone strikes, although there are less now. Pakistan, for example, I mean, American popularity in Pakistan, despite the fact that we, for example, we have the largest educational exchange programs with Pakistan of any country in the world, our popularity is in barely above the single digits. Drone strikes have something to do with that. So I think people in government realize in that same sort of continuum of the effectiveness of something on the military battlefield and what are the negative consequences in the public diplomacy world, that's something that people think about all the time. And that's one of the complexities about diplomacy, and people make those decisions every day. But it is absolutely a challenge to American public diplomacy. Hi.
Hi, I was wondering if there have been any on-the-ground domestic efforts to reach out to young Muslim men and women who are perhaps feeling disenfranchised, disillusioned, and are therefore more likely to want to join ISIS, or are most of those efforts directed at making sure those messages for recruitment aren't received and sent in the first place?
So even though I don't, my job is focused on foreign audiences. But there's a tremendous amount of effort that's going on in the domestic space, with everything from community organizations that are talking about mainstream Islam, to things that we're doing on the information battlefield in the U.S. And there is a new entity that operates out of the NSC at the White House that's run by a fellow named George Salim that is completely focused on the messaging in the domestic space. And I think that is a big challenge. And for many, many years, we always thought, well, anybody born and raised in America would never, ever consider any dastardly or terrorist act. And what we're seeing is that there are potential domestic threats of, so-called homegrown terrorists. And we're looking to help that on the macro messaging front. We're looking to help that in community action all across the country and many other things as well.
So let's go here, and then there's a hand over here.
I think there's a cost for voicing those concern, for those credible voice in the front line. For example, like in certain authoritarian country, you have some liberal thinkers disseminate these liberal ideas. They might be jailed, but there is certain countermeasure, like those people can be sent to the United States or something. But for those people on the front line fighting this terrorism, there might be fear of reprisal, and there's no mechanism to help them to fight this fear. So what?
So you
what
mean
is
the people, the actual credible voices in the region, or?
Yeah, in the region, in the foreign countries, for example, like in Russia, and they may fear that they might be attacked by the terrorists because they are very salient. And
Absolutely. I mean, these people are heroic. People who are, taking on ISIL or terrorist groups in the digital space. Looking at my old line of work, I mean, the journalists in those areas that are sometimes criticizing the government, sometimes criticizing extremist groups. I mean, they work under threat of death all the time. They're incredibly heroic, and it's something that fills me with admiration and awe. And but again, any difficult problem like this is going to take a tremendous amount of courage and bravery from the people who are on the front lines. I mean, King Abdullah of Jordan said, "Look, this is our problem," and it is. We can help people fight it, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the world will become a safer place when people who have something invested, people who have skin in the game, are the ones that take this on and win.
Hi. One of the major dissatisfactions I've heard from my Muslim friends in Egypt and here about the public discourse has been kind of the acceptance of ISIS, of the actual terminology, calling it the Islamic State.
Right.
And I've noticed, especially in local media in the Middle East, that there's been an effort to kind of specify the so-called organization or
Right.
the organization known as ISIS. Of course, it's more difficult to say than to actually effectively change the name used in discourse. But has there been any sort of campaign or any effort to kind of switch the way that we talk about it being the Islamic State?
Yes. So, good question. I will try to keep my answer short because there's someone could write a dissertation on this. So, my boss, the Secretary of State, calls ISIL Daesh, which is the Arabic acronym for ISIS, which is in the Middle East, and to members of Daesh is considered an insult. It's not treating them with respect. When I'm in the Middle East, I only refer to them as Daesh. We tried to kind of get it in the kind of currency of newspapers and TV, and it didn't really catch on. The White House uses ISIL, which is the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. Any Arabic scholars here can tell us what the Levant is? I love saying it, but and ISIS is the terminology that newspapers tend to use. Islamic State is what they want to be called because their goal is to be a state. So we would never even, under any circumstances, refer to them as Islamic State. It's possible you would say, so, as you say, so-called Islamic State. I mean, so the terminology is not unimportant. If I had my way, all of us would call them Daesh, but that hasn't worked out.
To what extent have other terrorist organizations such as Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda copied ISIL or Daesh's methods of publicizing themselves on the battlefield, or some of the other methods that you mentioned?
They've emulated them on this information battlefield. I mean, again, they're not as sophisticated, but we've seen Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram, use social media, use videos. Again, they are sort of flying the black flag of convenience, I think, and they tend to not actually have much ideological or philosophical compatibility with them. But what they have tried to do is learn from them in the social media space. And again, going back to what keeps people up at night is, what are the new entities that actually may get created in that digital field first before they are actually operating on the military battlefield and create a kind of cadre of people that is some amalgam of all these ideologies. I mean, that's the kind of unknown things that people worry about.
So it's been said a lot in Clinton's campaign has been talking a lot about how Trump's rhetoric against Muslims is a recruitment tool for ISIS. How valid is that statement? Does ISIS actually care about the current election, or does it fall on deaf ears?
So Teo, you're trying to get me in trouble, right? That's what you're doing. So by the way, there's something called the Hatch Act, which people in government are very worried about, which is that you're not allowed to show any kind of affiliation when you're in the government during a presidential campaign or any campaign. So that's my caveat. But you heard me say at the beginning that one of the core tenets of their ideology is that the West is against Islam. One of the reasons that we don't use the phrase radical Islamic terrorism is that all of our Islamic allies feel that what we are doing is demonizing a whole religion by talking about this, and it's utterly unfair. I mean, if you look at the number of Muslim foreign fighters who have gone to Iraq and Syria since the beginning, it's 40,000. It's 1/1000th of 1% of the Muslim population of the world. People know what the Muslim population of the world is? What? 1.5 billion. It's gigantic, and it's growing. So being mindful of that, when you have people talking about not allowing Muslims to immigrate to America, or having a religious test where people who are Muslim fail that test automatically, what does that do? That confirms their narrative that the West is against them. That isn't something that anybody who's fighting ISIL wants to hear. Moreover, nobody wants to hear it because it's absolutely and 100% unconstitutional. I mean, the fact that 229 years ago we said there cannot be a religious test for office, religious test for voting, is what made America exceptional to begin with. So I think on all those grounds, that kind of rhetoric is very unhelpful. Hey, Josh, how did I do on that one? Okay.
Hi. So in the presentation that you gave, you mentioned that there are a lot of people that are essentially recruited to be fighters, either originally in the caliphate, but now sometimes in other areas of the world. There's also a lot of women that are being recruited by ISIS, sometimes not for roles that are necessarily being fighters, but being in other areas of the society. Have you found any differences in terms of the way that they've been recruited, and also the way that you then counteract the recruitment of women versus men within the so-called Islamic State?
It's a terrific question. And again, let me go back to something I said before, because part of their original appeal was this altruistic appeal. Come to the caliphate and build the Islamic State that we've been trying to build for almost 2,000 years. So for women, it was often come and be a mother in the Islamic State. Have children who live in the caliphate. Part of their original appeal, they were trying to get doctors and architects and engineers to come to build the caliphate. So part of the original appeal for women was that altruistic, kind of almost philanthropic appeal. and they did get some recruits that way. I think now they're using some of that same weaponization of vulnerability for women, or women who have a grievance, or women who are very unhappy, who would come. But the actual recruitments towards women have diminished, in part because there is less of this Islamic State. And there's some interesting groups that do analytics of how the recruitment of women differs from the recruitment of men. And there's a terrific organization in London called the Institute for, not the Institute for Politics, this is the Institute for Politics. I'll think of the name in a second, that actually look at and do analysis of returned foreign fighters and what motivated them. But one of the interesting things that we've seen in terms of the kind of content that potentially dissuades so-called fence sitters from going there is the testimony of mothers who have lost their sons, or their sons have been suicide bombers. And this has a great pull on the young men to see the despair and sadness of their mothers. And so there's been a lot of content, counter-ISIL content, that has been created using first-person narratives from mothers who have lost sons or daughters.
You mentioned anti-ISIL messaging, and you also mentioned that ISIL will try to send a positive narrative about building a caliphate. Is there a positive narrative that we're trying to push to people who might be vulnerable?
It's a great question, and as everybody has said, unless we offer a better alternative, their appeal will have more effect. So one of the things that we've done in terms of public diplomacy is working with people who are creating new narratives. So, for example, I guess I'm not that anybody will care, I'm scooping myself, but we will, in a couple of weeks, I'm going out to Abu Dhabi for something we're calling the Sunnylands Initiative. The Sunnylands is a group that's affiliated with USC to help filmmakers in the Middle East and filmmakers in Hollywood work together to create content that has a more redeeming message, that offers a better alternative. We worked with Middle East Broadcasting, which is the largest satellite broadcaster in the Middle East. And there's a fantastic guy who runs it called Ali Jabber, who has created 2 programs during the last 2 Ramadans. Ramadans are like sweeps week on, where it's the most watched time in the Arab world. So those 40 nights, people put on series. And Middle East Broadcasting, the last 2 Ramadans, have done a series called Selfie 1 and Selfie 2, which is a satire of ISIL. It's about a father who pretends to want to be an ISIL fighter to rescue his son, who is an ISIL fighter. And even the name Selfie, it's both a joke about the selfie that we know from social media and a play on the word Salafi, which is this very, very strict form of Islam that has generated a lot of foreign fighters. So we're looking to help people like that create better content to get a wider audience. And I'm happy to say that is all growing. I mean, and that is a kind of alternative narrative, both in terms of mocking, say, ISIL, but also, what are alternatives for young men and women in the Middle East who, can have fruitful lives, without, following the siren song of violent extremism.
If I could just kind of piggyback on that, though, because that still sounded like mostly kind of anti-ISIL, like, satire. Yeah. You said you're an ambassador for Brand USA. What is Brand USA to you? If you had to sell the U.S., what is it?
So, I'll talk less about my view of it and talk about what resonates about the Brand USA around the world. And what resonates is that we're the country of innovation, of technology, of entrepreneurship, of meritocracy, and people, they may not like our policy, but they like the fact that we embody, and our society embodies all of those things. I actually just came from the Chicago Institute,
IIT,
and met with young Syrian refugee students who are there. One of them is the president of the student body, and he became a student there only in 2013. So what that also says is, boy, this is a country which prizes diversity, that allows people to succeed no matter what their background, that's what resonates about the brand USA around the world. And I think there are things that we do in the public diplomacy sphere. So for example, one of the things that President Obama started is this annual Global Entrepreneurship Summit. There have been 8 of them around the world where we bring young entrepreneurs, who are mainly social entrepreneurs, to come and meet American backers of businesses and to be able to give them better tools to be able to do that. I mean, that resonates all around the world. And it's a really positive part of what the US brand is. And it's actually the truth, too. I mean, you know, we are exceptional in that regard. And people aspire to be able to, you know, still aspire to be able to live and work here and be able to succeed.
Can you talk a little bit more about the way the GEC is structured and whether or not you spearhead your own initiatives or mostly play a supportive role?
So so actually at the top of the GEC, that coordinator of the GEC and the special envoy is a fellow named Michael Lumpkin, who was a longtime Navy SEAL who came over from the Defense Department and has really created a really functioning, operating entity that is kind of firing on all cylinders now. They do, you know, they help optimize content. They help plan campaigns. So one of the things we realized early on in the transition from CSCC to GEC is that this tit-for-tat messaging didn't work. Campaigns were the way to go. So for example, Sawab did a campaign early on, about a year ago, using the direct testimony of returned foreign fighters who said it, you know, how awful it was. That had much, much more engagement than any of the regular stuff that we did. So they're structured around campaigns, you know, helping third-party credible voices, doing data analytics, and coordinating all of the efforts within government. So those are the sort of pillars of the GEC, and it's growing and expanding and doing terrific work. And indeed, even one of the things we've seen is there's an initiative that Google has started. The old Google idea is called Jigsaw now. And one of the things they're doing is realizing that when people use search terms to search for who is the head of ISIL, you can serve them content through ads, through paid advertising, that is counter ISIL content. The Global Engagement Center is also using paid advertising for people who are looking for that kind of content, and then you give them content that says, well, you know, this is not what it's cracked up to be, you know, you have better alternatives, and this is a very effective way of finding the exact audience that you want. It's a much more tailored way of reaching the audience, which is the way that you know, commercial companies do it now. Hi.
Hi. So you've talked a little bit about the different mediums of propaganda that ISIS has. They have their print magazines, they have videos, they have, like, I know they have songs, and they have radio. And I'm sure you know from your background that different forms of media have different pros and cons. So is that something that you think about when creating these campaigns? Is that something, are they targeted campaigns for a particular type of medium?
It's a great question, and in part because you're right. I mean, they have been from the start almost like what I would call in my old life a full-service agency. So they're on social media, they're on television, they're producing video, they have billboards, they have kiosks, they have flyers. We're relatively limited in what we can do. We can't compete with, you know, billboards in Syria. And so there tends to be a false idea about how important social media is. It's anybody a sociology major here? Man, the University of Chicago used to have a lot of social science. So
they're all political science majors.
Okay. So in social science, they call the availability heuristic, which is that because you see something and it's available to you, it assumes a bigger proportion than it really is. So because we only see social media, you're not seeing a billboard in Syria. We think all they do is social media. That's a relatively small percentage of all the content that they were creating at their height. So we don't really battle in those other areas. But I also think now, because so many of them were actual kind of physical means of communication, that, you know, they don't have the territory to have billboards anymore or kiosks. So that seems to be going away.
So this is more generally addressing the idea of Brand USA. So the new legislation that would allow United States citizens whose families were victims of the 9/11 attacks to sue the Saudi government. Well, obviously the president rejected it, but the Senate overrode his veto. So how have you been involved in that, and what has your office's response been to all of that?
Yes, the president vetoed that bill, and it was that veto was overridden. And his argument, which is an argument that I absolutely support and appreciate from a public diplomacy sense, is that makes the U.S. vulnerable to all kinds of suits with people who have all kinds of grievances, because there would be reciprocity when we would allow this to happen to another sovereign state. And as emotionally gratifying as it might be to allow those families to sue Saudi Arabia, it has wider repercussions for the U.S. and for Brand USA as well. And rather, let's find another mechanism to have a better outcome rather than that one. So it's a good question, because it is a public diplomacy issue for us, and what we haven't seen yet is what the larger ramifications of it will be.
Thank you. Hi. So ISIL and a lot of groups choose to claim a lot of the attacks that they carry out. Could you talk a bit about the value of that and how we counter the impact of the claims, if they have any?
They've actually been relatively disciplined in terms of claiming attacks that actually have a kind of ISIL background versus some that haven't. That being said, we make a distinction, and have for a while, between so-called inspired attacks and directed attacks, and then there's a kind of continuum in between. And what they have started doing is claiming those inspired attacks by saying, this was a soldier of the Islamic State. And that in that El Adnani video that I mentioned before, basically he said, drive a car into someone, stab someone, pledge allegiance to ISIL before you do it, and then you'll be a warrior for the Islamic State. So in some ways, that distinction becomes less important in terms of their ability to claim attacks. But what we do worry about is those people, those kind of lone actors who take some kind of vengeance against people and do it in the name of Al-Qaeda or al-Baghdadi.
Way over there.
So after the Stuxnet virus came out, there was a lot of scare of terrorists or in lone wolves transitioning from actual physical attacks to cyber attacks. How worried are you about that development from ISIS, even though they're not technically a state right now?
From ISIL in particular, or just in general?
Both.
One of the things I learned in government is that when you're testifying before a congressional committee, if someone asks a question like that, you'd say, Senator, that is better addressed in another venue. And people realize it requires classified information. You don't have to answer it anymore. So there's some part of that is true. But what we're seeing in terms of kind of cyber warfare, even in the presidential election with the attacks on the DNC and the RNC and WikiLeaks revelation of emails from the Clinton campaign. This is a constant threat that people are worried about all the time. And many people believe that cyber warfare is really the next genre, the next platform of warfare. And if you think about whether it's the electricity grid, whether it's water systems, whether it's airports and airlines, I mean, these are all susceptible to cyber attacks. And people are working, night and day in government to both strengthen our systems and to have capacity ourselves to both prevent it and to exercise some kind of reciprocity. So it's a really emerging area where we'll see a different kind of combat, and I think we're just, alas, at the beginning of that. And where it goes, it's hard to say.
Yeah, right in the middle here.
We're not going to go until there are no more questions, are we? Or is it? Okay.
One more, don't worry.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Thank
what
you.
happens if this doesn't end? So, for example, we've been in Iraq for 13 years, and what happens if this war goes on for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years? How is it our responsibility to respond to the situation as time goes on? And what happens if they actually do become a state and they do eventually become recognized by the international community in 15 or 25 years? What would happen at that point? Thanks again.
I think I'll take the latter part of your question first. I mean, I think their potential to actually become a state doesn't exist anymore. Wasn't very high to begin with, and I think the success on the military battlefield, you'll soon see the coalition taking Mosul, will eventually take Raqqa, which is their headquarters. They will cease to exist in a physical way anymore in Iraq and Syria. That being said, the unintended consequences is what do they morph into? Of course, there are ISIL branches now in different places around the world, in Libya, in Yemen, and we're also very, very concerned about tamping those down as well. But the unknown is what succeeds them, what kind of groups, and using what kind of methods, maybe even cyber terrorism that we see grow out of this. And some of this is, in the realm of science fiction, but it's also things that people in the government and the NSC think about and worry about and try to plan for. But I think the scenario of them becoming an actual state is off the table now.
Please join me in that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.